Bouget. I'm an extension educator in Le Sueur and Blue Earth counties. So I pretty much help with technical service calls ranging from insects to like we're going to do today, all the way to forestry or agriculture.
Yep, and I'm Claire LeCan. I'm the extension educator in Ag, Food, and Natural Resources in Rice and Steele counties. So similar position to Shane's, just in the slightly different neck of the woods. So we'll get going here. We'll first talk about what beneficial insects are, kind of our broad classes of beneficial insects, what they need, and what we can do to help them succeed and attract them to our properties ideally. So a lot of times we think of pollinators as our #1 beneficial insect. And further than that, we think of honeybees. That's really been the poster child of all of our pollinator efforts, right? Our honeybees. And they are important pollinators, no doubt, but they are not native to North America. They're actually domesticated and kept by honeybee keepers. And they are economically important in Minnesota because many people rely on them for honey and profits from their honey. But they're really not a native beneficial that we are trying to conserve, to keep natural function up and about. So honeybees get a lot of attention, and other than that, bumblebees get a lot of attention as far as pollinators go. And that makes sense because they're cute and fuzzy and not little and green and sucking sap out of your plants. So I get it. But we have more than just honeybees and bumblebees. We have a huge diversity of bees in Minnesota. This image shows actually the diversity in North America or the United States as a whole. So over 3,600 species in the US and about 400 species of bees in Minnesota. So you can see here, honeybees and bumblebees make up a very small chunk of the pie here. So we have lots of other native bees that are helping pollinate our plants. And we have other insects that help pollinate our plants too. Wasps actually are good for something. They're pretty decent pollinators as well. And they have other roles as far as being predators in the landscape, and we'll talk about that. Butterflies are pretty good pollinators, moths, ants, beetles, even flies are pretty good. Bees are probably our most efficient pollinators, but any of these insects that move pollen around, even incidentally, are considered pretty important pollinators. Some of our flies are even such good pollinators or visit floral resources so often that they mimic bees or get the same coloring as bees. So again, pollinators are important because they help with an increased fruit set in many cases. They provide honey and other products, and they generally help the health of an ecosystem.
But as Claire talked about, we learn all about these wonderful aspects of our pollinators, but we want to know what happens when these guys show up. So I know a lot of people were talking about aphids. I think the top left would be an aphid giving birth to itself is a nice way to describe it, asexually reproducing. We have some scale insects over there, and then we have our tomato hornworm on the bottom. So a lot of our bees, they might be visiting our floral plants or our garden plants, but they're not going to be negatively impacting these pests. They're just going to go right by them and get to the floral resources that we have out.
And this is also where we like to point out that pest and beneficial insects are labels that we give the insects as humans, right? All insects have a role to play in the ecosystem. It's just whether they get out of hand or not. And it can be kind of problematic to put labels on them because even some of what we consider our big pest insects, like the tomato hornworm here, is a pollinator in part of its life. So it becomes a sphinx moth that is actually a decent pollinator, a nocturnal pollinator, so pretty important in the landscape.
And this is just illustrating, we have a buff-tailed bumblebee, you think, Claire?
Yep.
Right on this mustard, and then you see a herbivore pest. I'm not sure exactly, maybe a cabbage devourer of plants, and you just see him like, yeah, I'm just here, I don't care what you're doing to the plant. I just want to get to my flower and get some nectar and or pollen.
Yeah, beneficials and pests coexist in our landscapes. So the broad groups of beneficials that we'll be touching on today are pollinators, natural enemies, which consist of our predators and parasitoids and parasites. And then we're not going to talk about them so much today, but we also have a lot of beneficial soil insects that are decomposers or even kind of dung lovers and help break down poo that way. But focusing mostly on our natural enemies today.
So a lot of times our natural enemies are a hidden tool. It's not something we go out to the store and buy and bring back. It's a form of biological pest control. So we have life that's checking life. A lot of times they can be good against pests that are resistant to insecticides. A lot of times, you know, it might be sometimes when we apply a lot of different types of pesticides, we can select for resistant pests. A lot of times Colorado potato beetle is kind of one of these types of critters that is naturally kind of resistant to a lot of the garden chemicals that we would apply. But if it's going up against a natural enemy or beneficial insect, a lot of times those defenses are limited. It's also very important for a healthy ecosystem in wider span of things to make sure that it serves on important checks on pests as well as other insects to keep the system functioning. Okay, so we have, and it's not really an either or with pollinators and natural enemies. We'll talk more about this as the presentation goes on. But one of the great things about promoting pollinators is that you also help to promote some of these natural enemies as well. And when I say you don't have to go to the store to buy them, there's no direct costs usually. So when we're buying things, we're mostly buying floral resources or seeds or other types of establishment materials, not necessarily the insects themselves. So our predators, this is a type of natural enemy that is not too picky about what it puts in its mouth or its mouth parts. This would include things like your pirate bugs, your lady beetles. Sometimes people will call pirate bugs no-see-ums. They're kind of the critter that has a really nasty, painful bite, and you find a little teeny guy on your arm. That's probably a pirate bug. But your lady beetles get all the press, all right? They eat a lot of the animals that people were talking about on here today, particularly the aphids. And there's also a tiger beetle on there in the bottom right. I usually get a lot of those in the office. People will bring in tiger beetles and think it's emerald ash borer or another type of insect. But tiger beetles are also really a great beneficial insect and general predator. And important to note that when these predators are out doing their job, they can be a predator in a certain life stage. So there'll be some critters like a lacewing where they're more attacking or being a predator when they're young and larval stage. Once they become adults, their food might change. And that's just a way for these animals to survive a harsh environment. So this is a great, so Claire has found these great comics. So we all think that ladybugs are nice and peaceful, but they're just trying to make a living like all of us, and a lot of their living happens to be eating aphids.
Very effective biocontrol, yes. So we, like Shane mentioned, a lot of our beneficials are equally beneficial or even more voracious and hungry when they're in their larval or immature stages. So we would like to ask you here, which one of these critters do you think is a lady beetle larva? We've got our poll going here. We'll let a couple more votes come in. All right, we'll end it and just share the results that a good chunk of you, 52% of you, got it right. B is our lady beetle larva.
And do we want to talk? And then I think that we'll show you what the other critters were.
Yes. Yep, they are all beneficials.
Yes.
In here. So we've got green lacewing larva, our lady beetle larva, of course. That's actually an Asian lady beetle larva, still a good aphid eater. Firefly larva, and then our minute pirate bug larva, the aureus, or excuse me, nymph, because it is a hemipteran. So the other three have larval stages. Aureus has a nymphal stage.
Yeah, so here's our green lacewing. This was the one where I was talking about this. The larval stage was always kind of interesting to me. It looked quite fierce, long, but it's also quite a voracious predator. And one of the things I see a lot of gardeners or farmers I work with is when you show them the eggs. So you can see on the top right here that the green lacewing has these types of eggs that are held by a thread onto the leaf structure. And it's really kind of a distinctive thing to keep a lookout while you're in your garden. That would be a very good sign that it's a green lacewing or a lacewing of some sort. The adults are not predators as the larval stages are, but they still have appetites. They still have to eat like all of us. So a lot of them will go after some of these floral resources or pollen, and even grass can have some of these resources. We're going to show you a lot of these where we can. We can show you the eggs as well. Just so that when you see them on your plants, you don't immediately squish them. Because I think we have a really kind of a drive to squish things that, you know, if they're eggs, we just assume that they're a stink bug or some other type of pest, when a lot of times these could be beneficials. So the next predator here is our multicolored Asian lady beetle. These were introduced to the North America several times to control varying pests. They do an excellent job with eating a lot of our aphid pests in our state. But one of the things, the best way, one of my favorite ways to identify whether it's a multicolored Asian lady beetle or another type is to look for this marking on their near their head. And I think it looks like the University of Minnesota logo. So that's always a good way for me to determine. And that's not always foolproof. Sometimes Asian lady beetles, they have lots of markings on them, but it helps you most of the time to figure out whether you're dealing with that. Now, University of Wisconsin people, they're going to say it looks like, you know, University of Wisconsin and it's backwards, but we all know what it really looks like, right?
I warned Shane about even including that option there. We know it's a U of M.
No, but they have very interesting life stages as well. You can see the eggs in the bottom left, the pupa stage in the middle, and then of course our larval stage, which so many of you guys got right.
Yeah, and other lady beetles have larvae that looks very similar. It'll just be that the color pattern and potentially the size is a little bit different. But other lady beetles look like that as well. And again, to let you look at some of the other life stages, we have fireflies. They are a really, really effective predator as larvae. They actually go after slugs and snails and other insect eggs as well. So they kind of look like a little armored alligator too or something, and just let them do their job out there. They're good at eating, and we saw that several of you had slugs as some of your pests of concern, and they would be good at taking care of those. So I always like to point out that even though they're called fireflies or lightning bugs, they're not flies and they're not bugs, not true bugs. They are beetles.
Okay, so now we're gonna, we talked a little bit about predators, and now we're gonna go to our other natural enemy, parasitoids. So a lot of times when we talk about parasitoids, we think of wasps and flies, and there's so much diversity even within one of these, but a lot of times those species that we have listed there, the Ichiman wasps, the braconids, and the tachinids, are going to be the ones that a lot of times people will see out in the garden. And one of the things that differentiates a parasitoid from a parasite is a parasitoid cannot complete their life cycle without killing the host. Parasite doesn't necessarily have to, it's mostly in the parasite's best interest to keep the host alive, but parasitoids have to result in the death of the host, or a lot of majority of the time. Now, while these guys are not munching on our pests, they still depend on floral resources, so your pollen nectar is food. So you can see a tachinid fly on the bottom left there. A lot of times there'll be a larger fly, and you'll see stiff hairs on them. It's usually a decent sign that it is a type of beneficial fly. We have an Ichiman wasp in the middle with a long ovipositor. It's not a stinger, but it's what the female uses to insert the eggs into the host pest. And then we have, it looks like we have a lepidopteran here on the bottom right that's been attacked by a couple different, or it might be, it looks like there's some eggs there from perhaps a tachinid fly, and then it also looks like it's getting attacked by a wasp of some sort. So these are unique animals, and they have kind of a unique life cycle. So I think we have maybe a comic coming up on this.
Yeah, and I would say, yes, we do. But I would say too that the predators, so some of those insects we classified as predators, also rely on pollen and nectar as adults too. So you can see that even our natural enemies that go after some of our pest insects need to be supported in the way of pollen and nectar as well. But yes, we do have a comic about being a parasitoid.
Yes,
so
Claire finds some great comics here.
Yeah. Go ahead, Shane.
All right, so a lot of us had problems with aphids. So this wasp will detect aphids that are on plant. And a lot of times parasitoids can detect these pest insects by a couple different ways. Sometimes they can detect it from the smell the animal makes, or the smell of plants that are being damaged. And it can find these critters. So this wasp found this aphid, made sure that the eggs were well taken care of inside the aphid, whether the aphid wanted to or not. I don't think that was the question. And then the parasitoid wasp emerges from the aphid. And yeah, it's a parasitoid life cycle. A lot of times people will say in the movie Alien or Aliens, you'll see a villain in the movie does a similar thing. But other parasitoids in action we can see are tachinid flies, so is laying eggs on Japanese beetles. A lot of times these flies will lay their eggs outside of the animal, and then as the larva develops, it'll tunnel inside the insect and kill it. We can also see in the middle there a samurai wasp, which is a parasitoid of brown marmorated stink beetles, which is an invasive pest to Minnesota.
Or stink bug, yep.
Stink bugs, sorry. And a lot of times with stink bugs, their eggs are kind of, and you can't really see it very clearly on there, but one of the ways to tell on some of these stink bug eggs is that they almost look like they have perforated tops, like they're ready to spring open with stink bug larva. But this is samurai wasp is a parasitoid that hits the egg stage of the brown marmorated stink bug. And then we also have our wasps. So there's several parasitoid wasps of emerald ash borer, another devastating invasive pest. Some will attack the emerald ash borer eggs, as this wasp is doing. Other wasps can sometimes use their ovipositor to find, to go through the wood or the bark of the tree and actually hit the larval stage of the emerald ash borer while it's tunneling. So it just tells you how remarkable some of these creatures are in order to detect these animals and also parasitize them.
And they
Now,
get more impressive.
yes, it gets even more impressive. Hyperparasitoids and other things that Claire and I thought were really interesting about some of these animals is that some of them actually can put more than one egg inside a host. Only one of them is fertilized and will become eventually an adult parasitoid. The other eggs will turn into a type of larval form and quote unquote defend their sibling inside the host from other parasitoids or other defenses. So it's very interesting how life can work. And like I said, one of the reasons that was that method of survival was used is that there are parasitoids that parasitoid the parasitoids. So we call those hyperparasitoids. And they lay their eggs in the host or even inside the wasp egg that was laid inside the host. One of the strange thing about these hyperparasitoids is that they limit the effectiveness of our control to some extent because they're serving as a check on the parasitoids that might be attacking the pests in your home or your garden. So a lot of times we find these guys in really diverse, healthy ecosystems, which is not a bad thing.
And
But
in case that concept is confusing, we have
yes,
another
we
comic
have
coming
another
up to
great
describe.
comment. Yes. Let's see if we
Oh,
can find it. There we go. Remember the wasp we talked about earlier with the aphid? Well, this vulgaris wasp decides to lay its egg in the egg of the aphid wasp, and a very similar set of events have occurred. So, very meta, according to the wasp. Well, one of the things that bugs me about beneficial insects and natural enemies, and it's not the cows. It's not really a Japanese beetle. It's not really brown marmorated stink bug. And it's not necessarily the emerald ash borer, although they're all really invasive, damaging pests. It's this. Ordering natural enemies online. So there's a lot of gardeners that are interested in ordering these creatures and think that they'll get really great control on their pest problems in their garden. But there's a lot of caveats with doing that. A lot of times there is little to no regulation on these animals. The species could be ineffective. It could be not adapted to the climate. It could be the wrong, especially if it's a parasitoid. If it's a wrong species, it may not parasitize the pest in your garden. And a lot of times, if they're not finding food, if it's for predators, especially if they're not finding the pest in your garden, they're going to leave. A lot of these animals are mobile, and they will fly away to find food. They're not going to wait until a pest outbreak before they start getting their dietary needs. Now, there are exceptions to this. If you have a greenhouse or a nursery set up where these beneficial insects can be controlled in their movement, that's another story. But when we're dealing with an open-housed garden in a relatively small area, and there's a lot of these caveats that you have to keep in mind before you set an order.
and we are seeing several questions in the Q&A that are getting at this concept here. So Shane, and my philosophy is definitely more of a, if you build it, they will come, a field of dreams approach. So if you have the right habitat, which we'll be talking about here, you can attract and hopefully keep your beneficial insects and not have to purchase them. And in fact, like Shane said, purchasing them really doesn't bode well for biocontrol because it's very likely they won't stick around.
Exactly. So again, it's not usually an either or with these critters. So what do you need to attract them? We talked a little bit about this. We need floral resources for sure, but we need some other things too. So we have our food sources, so our pollen and nectar. Those are not the same thing. Pollen is very important for animals in their growth, or their insects for their growth, or to feed their larvae. Nectar is kind of like an energy source, okay? Something like an energy drink. While they're out there foraging, they need a little bit of nectar to get themselves going. It's very important. So both of those are key. And some plants do more than others. They might have more pollen heavy or nectar heavy. Another thing is secondary prey. So if we have extra floral resources or other plants in the garden, a wide array of plants, if to keep our lady beetles happy or other predators happy and sticking around, they need to have secondary prey or secondary food resources. That could include other insects that are in your garden. So if we want to keep those guys in your garden until that pest comes, that would be a really good idea, is to have those food sources for them. And overwintering is also very important, or cover. Hopefully they're not overwintering in your house like a multicolored Asian lady beetle is known to do. But hopefully in things like plant residue that you have, any cover crops that you have that are overwintering, maybe you have some rye, or you have other plants that, or even oats. If you have a thick enough stand of oats and it dies in the wintertime, that can be a really nice habitat for a lot of critters. If you're lucky enough or fortunate enough to have woodlands and prairies, those can also be a very key resource for these animals to overwinter. And if we can go back one slide, Claire, I just want to brag a little bit about this. So the plant, these are all, and hopefully Troy will talk more about this with our cover crop section on species selection, but the ones that I usually think about, and if I have my garden, if I want to attract beneficial insects, and we'll go over more families, but for cover crops specifically, you can see in the top left there is Lacey Facilia. The Latin name is Facilia tannacetifolia, and you can tell I practice that quite a bit. No, but that's also called scorpion weed or bee's friend. It's related to the borage. It's a borage relative, and one of the things I really like about it, especially compared to the plant onto the right of it, which is buckwheat, is that Facilia tends not to be as weedy or have the potential to be weedy as buckwheat. But you still get the really nice bloom time and floral resources. Although buckwheat is also is a great insectary plant, especially if you're making honey. All right, and we can go to the next one then. So some other families. So I like to think about plants in terms of plant families. The ones that we usually see a lot of heavy interest from beneficial insects and natural enemies are things in the carrot family, dill, coriander, fennel. A lot of these small flowers are really good for some of these tiny parasitoid wasps and flies. When we think of wasps, we think of a large insect, but a lot of times these really beneficial wasps are extremely teeny, and a lot of times those flowers, if they're small enough, they can access all the floral resources with their mouth parts or their body. Aster family, yarrow, sunflowers, coneflowers, all really great for beetles, predatory beetles. You can see those leathery backed beetles always tend to hang out on a goldenrod or some of these other flowers. And then you have the mustard family, so sweet alyssum, that's always on a lot of lists, very easy to grow. A lot of these guys, the mustard family brings in a lot of pirate bugs and other wasps as well. So and kind of related to this, we can tolerate some weeds on our margins, especially if we have times of the year when our garden is not, doesn't have a lot of flowers or some of those food resources for our pollinators and natural enemies. We can tolerate some of these weeds, quote unquote. Though it could be Dutch white clover, common milkweed, some dandelions. Boneset is kind of a late flowering prairie plant, sometimes can be a little weedy. But we still have to be good stewards of the land. And there's some weeds that we need to make sure that we control and not tolerate, especially in our gardens. This includes creeping Charlie, which does have lots of flowers, but the floral resources tend to be junk food, right, Claire?
Yes. Yeah, so a lot of times people will see bees on creeping Charlie and think, oh, that's great for pollinators. It is not very great nutritionally. It's like pizza. They love it, but it's not super good for them.
Right. And then wild parsnip, of course. Now, wild parsnip is a noxious weed in Minnesota. A lot of other restricted noxious weeds we need to say no to, even if they might marginally provide something to a beneficial insect. We need to make sure that we're balancing the right choices in our garden and our yard. So and this is something where I told another respondent last lecture that we could spend another hour and a half just on the underground or the surface beneficial insects that are roam around the ground. But remember, we have a lot of residue that is our habitat for our beneficial insects. A lot of times we use the rototiller a lot in the garden when we don't always have to, whether a strip could do rather than doing a whole acreage. A lot of times if we could limit our tillage to spring rather than doing a fall tillage, and if we've got heavy soils, that can really help with that residue. And a lot of times people will have worries or concerns about residue and disease. And if you've got evidence or you've got a cropping history or area in the garden where you get a lot of blights and other things that are transmitted through residue, obviously toss it so that you don't impact your garden. And we have a ground beetle over there, which would really appreciate not being rototilled and
Yes.
having some habitat. I think so.
So I'll just talk a little bit now about some of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're attracting pollinators. So our bumblebees are social insects, so they do have a colony like honeybees do. And so they will do a colony or a nest either underground or right on the soil surface, usually in abandoned rodent burrows or existing cavities. Then we also have a good amount of our bees that are ground nesting bees. Actually, a large chunk of our even solitary bees also nest in the ground. And then we have cavity nesting bees, so bees that'll go into stems of plants typically and burrow and lay their eggs in the hollows of the plants that way. So we want to think about providing nesting habitat for them. And then these are just some rules of thumb for creating pollinator habitat. You want to have around 3 native flowers blooming in each of the 3 blooming periods. So you want a succession of blooming flowers out there, some in the spring all the way out through fall. And you want to go ideally for a diverse mix of flowers, different shapes, colors, sizes for our different size bees, or even our bees with different size and lengths of tongues. Even bumblebees range from pretty short tongue to long tongue, and they can reach a variety of floral resources. Also, incorporating grasses is important because some larval stages, particularly in our lepidopterans, our moths and butterflies, rely on grasses as caterpillars. Just an example of a succession of blooming. Pussy willow is a great pollen source in the early spring, all the way through to goldenrod at the end of the season in the fall. And aiming at those different shapes and colors. Here I like to quiz people and ask which of these are bees. And I won't put you through that, but I'll just point out that picture 1 and 3 are actually syrphid flies, and the one in the middle here is a bee. So these 2 are flies that are pretty good pollinators as well. If you're making a pollinator garden, you typically want to be in a sunny area, although there are some good flowering plants that are tolerant of shade as well. Again, go for that diversity. When you're making a garden, you want to cluster like plants together to some degree, just to make it a more attractive floral resource. Having water available is always great. Bees need to drink water too, so something that they can lap the water up off of, like rocks, tennis balls, marbles. I have a little bird bath out for my honeybees. You want single flowers typically, just because they have the reproductive parts, the anthers and the stamens. The anthers would have pollen on them. And then again, for our ground nesting bees in particular, leaving some bare undisturbed soil if possible helps them out quite a bit too with their nesting. Here's an example in front of my extension office in Steele County of a native pollinator garden with those principles of clustering like plants together. You can also make more of a prairie or meadow planting, and the good news is there's really no minimum size. Any amount of floral resources you can get out there helps our pollinator insects and our other beneficials too. The most important thing is just having a good variety and basically high quality flowers that are going to be nutritious for our pollinators and beneficials. As far as nesting goes, we just like to point out that those bee houses can be a great thing, but a lot of them that I see available at stores aren't deep enough. You really want to make sure you have stems available that are 4 to 8 inches long, really. That's how far most of our solitary bees want to lay their eggs, and they want to have some room to pad the hollow and cover it with leaves or other debris. And so you want to make sure it's deep enough. Really a good practice is even just leaving your stems out in the garden. I leave my hosta stems out, clip the tips off so that the bees can use them that way. And then you actually do want to keep them out until like mid-June to July even, to make sure the native bees have gotten out in the spring and summer. So one way, if you want to clean up your garden beds, you can clip them off at the bottom and just keep the stems in a pile in your yard, and then the bees can still emerge and be around.
So we talked, oh yeah, and then we talked about promoting pollinators, and this is like the win-win, right? We have these floral resources, we have secondary habitat, but if you are focused mostly on pest control and you want to make an investment simply for pest control, and you want to get a return, it's more complicated. When we talk about catering to natural enemies, and if you really want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of, and if you're taking this very seriously as almost a business, one of the things that's going to be out of your control in order to attract large amounts of beneficial insects or natural enemies is the landscape around you. So a lot of naturalists and entomologists that have been studying this call that landscape complexity. So what that means is that you have forest, you have prairie, you have a mix of different habitats for these animals. And a lot of having too much of this landscape complexity or too little may not pay in garden benefits. Again, this is kind of like you're looking at this as a business expense. This is especially true for those parasitoids. The parasitoids are a little bit more needy, and I guess is a way to say it, but the dynamics that judge their population can be very specific. When you look at an Asian lady beetle, it could go to the cornfield or the soybean patch and have plenty of food there. But if you're dealing with a very specific type of parasitoid, that may not be true. So one of the ways that you can kind of do this at home and to see whether you have landscape complexity in what type of situation you're in is to draw a circle on Google Maps. 2 miles seems to be one way to look at this. If you've got way less than 20% of that ground in natural space, it's going to be maybe fall on the too little side of things, where if you add things, that's great. We still need those for our insects. But if you're doing this, again, as a business expense, you want to bring in beneficial insects, the arithmetic doesn't work as much. What some of the scientists suggested, we're looking at something that we're close to 20 to 40% would be that sweet spot where you could make a difference by adding extra floral resources. But if you get over that 40%, then you're kind of like putting a drop in the bucket. It's you can go ahead and do it. But if you're looking for increased pest control, the evidence is not great. So this would be an example of maybe less than 20%. If you're in one of the farmsteads here, it could be very challenging to get an economic return when around you. If you're looking for if you're looking for a parasitoid for a certain pest that might be unique to your crop, looking at on that it could be a challenge. And something maybe like this might be a little bit better. We have some woodlands on the right side of the screen. We do have agriculture, but we have at least some other areas where these animals can, there's room for improvement. So if we can build some things on our property, we can attract kind of like a disproportionate amount of some of these beneficial insects. And then if we're in an area where it's very rich and different types of natural landscapes, then again, it's feel free to do it. But you know, it might be, may not pay for itself in terms of pest control because you've already surrounded by quite a lot of habitat.
Yeah, that is a great look at how landscape complexity can affect pest management. And then, of course, we have other methods of pest management along with some of our natural enemies and that. And in integrated pest management, we usually use more than one mode of pest control. So we would start by trying to promote our natural enemies, but at some point chemicals may be needed to get the kind of control that you're really after. And I just like to show this slide to show that organic insecticides, though we usually use them because we think they are the better option or the less toxic option, that does not necessarily mean that they're safe for insects. So there are some organic options that are non-toxic or less toxic for our beneficials and our pollinators and all of that. So BT is an example of that on this graph here. This is a document from the Xerces Society that's really useful actually in looking at these different insecticide options. But there are also organic insecticides like spinosad, which are still highly toxic to other insects in general, including our beneficials and all of that. Neem is also a common organic chemical that's used, neem oil, and that is lower toxicity, but again, still not completely benign. If a lot of these insecticides, if they're meant to kill insects, they will kill all insects, right? They're not particularly specific. There are some specific options or more species targeted options that are coming out. So if you want natural enemies to do their job and you want to protect pollinators, you may want to choose insecticides that are selective or again, kind of more species specific or effective against a specific order of insect, a specific type of insect. So you may pick something that has lower toxicity for non-target insects, and you can figure that out by potentially a signal word on the label of the pesticide that would say caution, right? That's going to be lower toxicity. It may be an EPA reduced risk product. That's one way. These are just some ways of looking for things that are maybe a little more specific or a little less toxic. And the chemical could also list the insect orders for which it's effective. So that's the route I like to take, is really try and find something that's going to be specific against the order of insect, at least, that I'm after. So some products that are coming out that may be more selective would be Savanto, which is an insecticide by Bayer. It targets these key insects, so a lot of our piercing, sucking pests. And then also this is labeled for a broad range of horticulture crops. So if this is something you're interested in, make sure that the crop you're wanting to use it on is on the Savanto label. And then there's also Safina, which is by BASF. And they also, there's some different piercing sucking pests, but again, it's targeting that order Hemiptera, similar to Savanto. So aphids, psyllids, whiteflies, and the like. And it is also labeled for a pretty wide range of horticulture crops as well. Also soybean and cotton are on the label too. So again, make sure that the plant you're trying to control your pests on is on the label, but these are some options that are becoming available. There's also BT. So that is a toxin from a soil bacterium, and there are different BT products available. You can usually find this with a quick internet search, actually. So BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, and then there's different varieties. So BTK is effective on butterfly and moth larvae, our lepidopterans, our caterpillars. BTG is effective on beetle larvae, possibly some beetle adults, depending. So again, check that label. And then BTI is effective for mosquitoes, black flies, fungus gnats, larvae, and that. So those are some of the products that are available out there, again, that are quite selective in the scheme of things.
So some of our main takeaways is, again, pollinators and natural enemies aren't mutually exclusive. You can attract both. Just making sure that you have the ability to recognize some of these natural enemies is really important, because then you can kind of tailor things. If you're dealing with a certain pest like aphids, maybe you can tailor things by picking flowers that are good for them. But by and large, it's a win-win most of the time if you're planting additional resources. And, you know, again, paying attention to your surroundings, knowing what your pests are. If you know what your pests are that you get year in, year out, and you know what can prey upon them, that could be really, really important information for you when you're making your decisions about species selection in the garden.
And we like to say, think about life from the insect's perspective. So think about the resources that your beneficial insects need and the kind of habitat that would be most conducive to their success. And just keep in mind with all of this that your garden, your yard, your field is an ecosystem. So those insects are interacting with each other through competition, predation, parasitism, and they are, to a degree, taking care of themselves in a healthy, diverse system anyway. So with that, we like to encourage you to think about which habitat you would prefer if you were an insect. And we can take questions.
Yeah.
All right, so we do have quite a few questions for you, Shane and Claire. Thank you both for that presentation. We did have, I'm going to do really bad at pronouncing these names. Tachinid flies, how do we introduce them or attract them to our yard?
That's a good question. As far as the flies go, the tachinid are quite large flies. I'd have to do a little bit more research to figure out what floral species work with them best. I've seen them on a lot of different types of plants, especially ones that anise hyssop or other types of kind of just great pollinating plants in their own right that are highly rated for tachinid flies. I think you can correct me if you're wrong, Claire, but you know, things like anise hyssop or catmint, I've seen a lot of them. But you might.
Then probably bee balm or, you know, some of those mints would be good. Yeah.
We have had a lot of questions about the decline of fireflies, and I have tried to answer some of them, but Claire and Shane, can you speak to that? Because there are fewer fireflies now than there were when I was a child.
I don't know if I've seen great conclusive statements on, or, you know, research on why that is. Shane, do you? I guess.
No, I think it's an active area of research, and it's kind of like honeybees, where there's a lot of different suspects. But I think a lot of it has to do with just having enough food. Floral resources is a huge one. A lot of the research that I've seen, it's just the matter of habitat and floral resources.
And that's kind of what I've seen. I visited firefly.org, and they said it's not only decline in habitat, but it's also an increase in light. And so fireflies attract their mates by lighting up. And if the prospective mates can't see their lights, then they don't create new fireflies. But, and then Maxine says she read that oh, I missed it.
That's all right. Okay, so
Yeah. I
question.
think light pollution is actually an interesting hypothesis on that. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that. Go ahead, Katie.
A few questions about bumblebees. How can you identify the nests kind of in the ground? And then also there was a question about those purchased homes, thinking that they weren't a good idea because they encourage mites or can be spread. So anything on those two?
Yeah, for bumblebees, you can tell because they make spherical cells. So unlike if you think of a honeybee hive, they make the hexagon shape, right? Where bumblebees, if you found a nest in the ground or on the ground that had spherical, like 3D circles, and clusters of that would be a bumblebee hive. Otherwise, you can also kind of follow where bumblebees are going. If you see a bunch in your yard that are going toward one area, that's a clue that there's a hive nearby. Was there a specific reason you would be looking for the nest or anything? Or?
They were just wondering about that. And then a separate question, but along those same lines, is whether or not those purchased bee houses can promote mites and that.
Yeah. Yeah, they can. So if you do that, I think the recommendation is that you either find one that is disposable, right? So you use one that's disposable, so you're not using it year to year, or one that you can clean. Or sometimes I think there's a picture on my slide of kind of a wooden frame, and then you could replace the stems in there each year. So that would be one way to counteract the mite and disease issues.
Couple of questions around creeping Charlie, whether or not it's actually beneficial, and there's a lot of mixed data on that. And then is there a way to control it without using a chemical that would be harmful to insects?
I just want to make sure. So there's a really popular, and there was an Iowa State Extension article a long time ago that promoted this, and it kind of got out of hand. So as far as control, we do not recommend using borax or boron to control for creeping Charlie. So I just kind of want to get it out there before anyone asks about that. One of the problems with that is if you add way too much, it can have a persistent negative effect in the soil. So it's kind of the same line of thinking of people using salt for asparagus. And yeah, creeping Charlie may have reduced tolerance to boron, but if you apply a lot and you plant something later on, that could be negatively affected by the excess boron. So I just want to get that out there before we go any more about creeping Charlie, because I hear a lot about using borax or boron, and there's better ways to do that, but it's a tough weed.
Yeah, and a lot of the weed killers for creeping Charlie aren't necessarily harmful to the insects because they're not an insecticide, they're a herbicide. So that's something to think about. And creeping Charlie does have the jackpot effect where like that one flower will have a ton of pollen, so they get really excited, and then all the rest of the flowers don't really have much. So you'll see them going to it, but whether and how much they're actually getting is hard to say. What are your feelings about ants? I seem to have them, an overabundance of them for some, and some seem to ruin certain plants, creating air pockets in the roots or something along those lines.
Yeah, well, they can be good pollinators, right? But in large abundance, they can definitely be a pest or cause issues in your turf grass. And so, I mean, I would follow the principles for integrated pest management. Start with the least invasive method that you're comfortable with, and then work your way up. If you really want to get rid of them, then you probably will be looking at an insecticide, probably a bait insecticide.
For me, when I think about ants in the garden, I usually think of them as a neutral. They could be a sign of something that is not great. They could be kind of just out there hunting. for me, they're kind of a neutral insect. If I see them in the garden, I'm not freaking out right away unless I know why they're there. That can be hard, but I think to me, if I see an ant, it's neutral. Like, okay, it's there. Is there anything else that I can directly attribute it to that ant?
Yeah, that's a good philosophy.
Do sedges count as grasses when it comes to beneficial insects?
Yeah, sedges are important in pollinator habitat too. Yep.
They're technically not
they're
a grass,
different.
but
Yeah.
they still are reproducing and using pollen. So.
Yep.
What about putting different kinds of plants next to each other that, quote, naturally control pests?
Now, this is controversial. There are a lot of plants that people say will repel certain insects. I think marigolds are usually the one that comes to mind. I think that I'm not aware of really convincing evidence that is telling me that these plants are specifically effective in certain repellents. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not convinced yet about certain plants that are like that or have that as a trait.
I would agree. We don't have solid data, but if you want to try it in your own garden, sure.
Yeah, low risk. And as far as putting different kinds of plants together that are attractive to insects, that's a good strategy. I mean, to attract beneficial insects.
Yeah. Bees are really interesting, and a lot of insects are like that, where they might like that order. You know, just having everything mixed together. You think that would be quote unquote natural, but to a bee, it's a little bit more of a chore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about a pesticide for common houseplant insects such as mealybug or scale, anything like that?
Typically, I recommend managing those physically by scraping them off with your fingernail. If you're okay with that, if that grosses you out, you could wear a glove or use paper towel, even a damp paper towel, and wipe off the scale insects or mealybugs. That's typically what I recommend. Just usually not cost effective to manage them inside in your house plants.
Yeah, and as far as other things like fungus gnats, and you can use. So Claire talked about the BTI, the
yes, you can. Yeah.
The Israeliensis. That can be used. I've had some success with it, but a lot of times the yellow sticky traps can hit the adults, and then if you really wanted to go IPM, you could use some of those labeled BTI or products in water that you put into the potted plant, or but yeah, it varies. You have to read the label on specifically how to apply that to the house plant.
And with fungus gnats inside, you can try to manage that with your watering too. Often they're attracted to overwatered houseplants.
Yep, exactly.
Is there a less toxic thing to use on iris borers other than spinosad?
Borers are always tough. A lot of times they're taking shelter from topically applied insecticides. Their damaging stages. I'm not super familiar about iris borers, but for vine borers and other things, you want to hit the adults where you can see them before the larvae become protected inside the plant. I don't know if that. I have to look it up, do more research about iris borers, but I'm not aware.
If you want to send that to me, Shane, I can contact her.
Sure.
Is there an answer to sawflies?
Well, I'll tell you what will not work on sawflies is BT will not work on sawflies, because sawflies are part of the Hemipterum family. So bees and wasps, they're more closely related to those guys than the butterflies and moths.
Right, so using the BTK, that's for lepidopterans, for butterflies and moths, wouldn't work on them. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know, it really would depend on the sawfly to some degree, what kind it is. Are you dealing with rose slug or?
It didn't specify. Just
okay. Yeah.
What do you recommend for control of SWD in raspberries? And I will just put a plug that on our extension.umn.edu website, there's a really great page that talks specifically about SWD. If you just search SWD, it's the first thing that pops up. And that goes everything from IPM to traps. So I don't know if you guys have other things to add to that, but that would be
that would be where I'd go to. I think there's a lot we still don't know about them.
Lots of research still being done.
I think we're still trying to figure out whether they overwinter in Minnesota or not. And that's like a big question we need to answer. So we don't, I think we need to do more research. That's a good
We have
question.
swarms of mosquitoes around our house. We live near water. Are there any natural or other remedies or plants that might help but not impact the beneficials?
BTI, so that BT is Israeliensis, is effective for mosquito larvae and black fly larvae too. So I know someone said in the chat earlier that they were dealing with a lot of those allergies. So BTI is a good way for that. Do you know any plants, Shane?
Again, we're getting into that. We're repelling.
Not repelling, no, but
yeah, but you might see sometimes it might be dunks or floating things that have some of that BT chemical in there that will hit the larva of those mosquitoes. You know, standing water, things like that are just making sure you're on top of that. What you can control, standing water, and then if you can't control it, using some of those products might be effective.
Yeah, so that's a good clarification. You're putting the BTI into the standing water. That's where you're treating for the larvae. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Do ground bees or sweat bees compete with honeybees? I have all of these are the honeybee hives nearby. Not sure what to do with the ground bees.
I don't worry about competition. Your honeybees will go up to 5 miles from their hive to forage, and you know, with the density of bees in your area, it's probably not a real competition. It's, yeah.
Are violets a good source of pollen or nectar for bees and other beneficial insects?
I think
I'm not sure about the violet, which one it's higher in or how nutritious it is. What about you, Claire?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head specifically how nutritious it is either.
I wouldn't say it's any worse than most of your other plants.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I could bring up the slides on some of these questions that are asking about the slides.
Yeah, if you want to do that.
Okay.
And while you're doing that, if a beneficial insect to control your aphid situation in a reasonable amount of if a beneficial insect does not control the aphid situation in a reasonable amount of time, what would you recommend?
So one of the things, we didn't really get into it today, but one of the things that we see with predators and parasitoids is that you might have a population boom of pests, and then the predators and parasitoids will lag a little bit before they hit it. So that's why it's really important to have all those secondary food resources and habitat for these critters to have them stick around in your garden. If the beneficial insects are not controlling the aphids on your plants, I'll have to look at particular products, but most of those things that are labeled that Claire talked about with those piercing sucking insects, I don't know if you can bring that slide up again, Claire, but some of those products might be effective for aphid control and still keep our bees and beneficial insects trucking.
I can bring that one up
Yeah.
too. Can you see my slides?
I can
Yep.
see the
Okay.
Asian lady beetle slide, yeah.
Yeah, because there was a question about this, just wanting us to describe which each of these life stages are. So the far left here are the eggs, and then you can kind of see the larvae coming out of the eggs here. So the larvae is the next life stage over here. And then to become an adult from the beetle larvae stage, the larvae pupates, becomes a pupa, and that's kind of equivalent to like a butterfly's chrysalis, and then becomes the adult beetle. So when you see tiny little beetles, they are adults. They're not baby beetles. Baby beetles don't even look like beetles in a lot of cases. So these are the signs you can look for that you have lady beetles in your garden. And I think there was a question too asking the difference between ladybug and Asian lady beetle, and maybe somebody answered this, but they both are lady beetles, right? They're in the family Coccinellidae, so they're in the same family. They're eating insects, doing basically the same function. It's just that our Asian lady beetles are invasive, right? They're not native to
I would say they're introduced.
introduced.
Some
Okay,
people
you're
might say
right. We shouldn't
invasive.
call them invasive because
Yeah.
they're not causing huge economic problems or anything. But people don't like them versus some of our native species because they go in our homes to overwinter, like Shane pointed out. And their bites are stronger, where they have been known to have the potential to break skin, where a lot of our native lady beetles won't. They're not biting intentionally, though. Usually it's just incidental biting. The other question with the slides, oh, you could do another question. I can get to the next
Well,
slide.
if you could maybe to answer the question I was answering about the aphid control, looking for low toxicity for bees.
Okay. Okay, then I'm gonna stop sharing so you don't have to see me go through all the slides
Okay.
because that's at the end.
Any pollinator-friendly solution to brown rot fungal disease in stone fruit? I've only seen copper fungicide recommended, but it is toxic.
That's a good question. I'm not super knowledgeable about fruit tree crops, but we do have some great people at the U that can help you. Annie Claude is our fruit specialist at the university in extension.
Or I would say reach out to your local extension educator, and then we can work on that kind of one-on-one.
So here's the slide you were asking about, Shane.
Yep. So a lot of these, so these are over the counter, so to speak. They're not restricted use, right, Claire?
Right. Yep. They're not restricted use.
Right. So there's going to be, those are some of the chemicals in that next slide, or the slide that you had, which low toxicity, high toxicity. You get to that one.
Yep.
Yeah, for aphids, again, the most important thing is making sure that you're reading the label and that it's labeled to control aphids. But some of those, I'm thinking most of the, I'm trying to think for aphids what we usually use that would be on here. So that a lot of times, yeah, that would be cautious with using those, yeah, but it could be very effective.
Insecticidal soap is really effective for aphids because that soap gets rid of their waxy covering and drowns them. We have found insecticidal soap working really well, and it's a relatively safe.
Right. Yeah, to be, you know, a lot of times it's the ones that I see people use for aphids are those pyrethrins, where there are those concerns, and there are concerns in agriculture too with pyrethrin use and other use 7 or carbaryl especially.
Depending on what kind of area you're working with, I try to knock back aphids on just a few plants if I have them. I knock them back with heavy hosing, but that's not always an option.
Kind of like Japanese beetles, you want to try to get them early and take them off physically if you can before it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
All right. Thoughts on nasturtiums?
Nasturtium flowers?
Yeah, that one.
They're great. I like to eat the flowers, but I don't know how well they do in terms of pollinator resource. I have to look it up, but I would look at the Bee Squad has a really great resource for flowers that you could easily plant in your garden. Almost all of them are low maintenance or minimal maintenance. I don't know if we can post the link on the chat about that, but that's a good resource if you're looking for just flower ideas. But
last noticed that Japanese beetles flocked to my basil plants and populated other plants in my yard much less. Is there a reason for this that can be effective in planting my garden?
They love basil. I have been bombarded by Japanese beetles while eating salad that has basil in it. So yeah, they do love basil. I guess you could use it as kind of a trap plant like that if you wanted to. So planting that strategically around your yard away from plants that you care about. But you also run the risk of attracting more to your yard if you're planting a lot of one of their favorite plants. So kind of the same concept of those, similar concept to using those beetle pheromone traps.
My peonies have brown spots on the stems, not sure if it's an insect.
I'd probably talk to your local agent if you can. We'll probably
Pictures help.
Really good photos. Yep. Yeah.
And there was a question asking about what these insects were on our slides here. So we have Japanese beetle, brown marmorated stink bug, and then emerald ash borer.
These are not to size. The emerald ash borer is tiny.
Yes.
Probably the biggest guy on there could be a female brown marmorated stink bug, but.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. And so there are several lookalikes. I think that was part of the question. There are several scarab beetles that kind of look similar to Japanese beetles. There's lots of different kinds of stink bugs. Some of them are beneficial, some are predators, some are herbivores like brown marmorated. And then there are some other bright green insects out there too that often get mistaken for emerald ash borer. So I'd say look online, send photos to Arrest the Pest at MDA, or again, send pictures to your local extension educator.
Exactly.
All right. If I have chickens, should I worry about them foraging for my beneficial insects?
I think it's it's probably likely that they're going to eat some. I think that there's just you have to look at the benefits of having your chickens run into your garden, and are they doing more damage, or are they fulfilling a very important service to your garden? I don't know, Claire, what you think, but I think you just got to look at the pros and cons of those chickens in that ground.
Yep, similar feelings with that, Shane. They're not only choosing your beneficial insects, they're going to be eating probably some of your pest insects as well. And, that's maybe part of a role of a beneficial insect is to be food for another critter. So it's all, I guess I agree, it's all part of the ecosystem that you have going on in your yard.
Thoughts on diatomaceous earth? Sorry if I butchered that name.
No, you got it.
You said it right. Yep.
I've had some success with it on a few things, but I think a lot of times people will use it indoors, or I have as this is just an experiment, but I've tried it on a few plants before that had some Japanese beetle issues. I don't know, Claire. I think it's something where, mileage may vary. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it depends on how you're using it too. So some people, I've seen many creative ways of using diatomaceous earth, and I'd say what it does is it gets between the exoskeleton of the insect, so it can open up the insect and kill it that way. And so just keep that in mind when you're trying to use it, that it has to come into contact with the body of the insect.
Mm-hmm. And kind of like neem or some of these other ones, if you have rain events, a lot of times these materials will be ineffective.
Good point. Yep.
Sawflies on pines.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some. I actually, there are a few species that will hit pines. Again, I'd have to, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, Claire, but I'd have to do a little bit more research. But there are lots of sawflies that will hit evergreens.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there are. I mean, I think that some of our insecticides would probably be the most effective control if you have a good amount of them. And again, you want to scout, see how many you have, whether they're causing a detrimental issue to your tree, and that's how you can decide if you should do something about it.
Right.
All right, we're getting kind of close to the end here. There is one there, the imidacloprid, acceptable for use on houseplants.
I'm not sure if there's a product where imidacloprid would be the active ingredient for a product that's acceptable on houseplants. I don't know off the top of my head. Do you, Shane?
Most of the
Definitely
time,
I think that's a restricted use.
imidacloprid.
Well, I guess it depends. Yeah, it depends on what product.
There's drenches that people will use outside, and they're systemic. But I don't know if it was imidacloprid, but it is a neonicotinoid like that. I off the top of my head, I think it is. I don't know for houseplants.
I don't.
But it would be something what we call a systemic, where it would be absorbed through the plant and expressed through all the parts. So if an herbivore or a pest would come and eat the foliage or attack the plant, they would get that insecticide and die.
And I
On
am,
a house plant, you wouldn't have to worry about this, but that's where systemic insecticides, because it's available in all parts of the plant, it's in pollen and nectar as well. And so the systemic insecticides like imidacloprid can cause issues for pollinators or other beneficials that are eating the pollen and nectar.
I'm seeing that Bonide makes a specific house plant insecticide that is imidacloprid.
Yeah.
So
Okay, thank you.
I wouldn't be surprised. It seems like
Mhm.
it's something that can be put in a solution. And
Two more here, and then we've run out of time. So standing water, but tons of mosquitoes. Is BTI still a deterrent or something that I could use effectively in my yard?
Yeah, and it's not a repellent even or deterrent. It is actually the insecticide that will kill them. So if you apply it in your standing water,
They don't have standing water.
they don't have a lot of, well, okay. Well, if you do have any standing water, that's where you would apply it. I don't know, Shane, any other thoughts on how they could?
yeah, there's a lot of things like last year in this, or a couple years ago in the summer, we had really bad swarms of black flies or gnats and
Yeah.
mosquitoes. And sometimes they're just these things where you can control what you can control in your garden. If you've got pots and pans that are filled with water or standing water,
Get rid of those.
yeah, if you've got those all around, just trying to work on that can cut a little bit on mosquitoes. But yeah, there's a lot of I see people spraying a lot of stuff. But when we're dealing with, outside the lawn, it can be hard to see whether that would be really effective or not.
Even if you get rid of and can control all of the larvae, let's just say, on your property, you're still going to encounter adult mosquitoes because of how wide their range is. So yeah, like Shane is saying, control what you can, but you'll probably still encounter adult mosquitoes.
Last one, super quickly, what to do for cutworms?
So I believe ground beetles can prey on cutworms.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a specific treatment, I'm not sure off the top of my head. A lot of times these guys can hide in the soil or around the soil near the plant they just cut. But I do know that ground beetles are one of their natural enemies.
And if you have baby plants that you put in, a cutworm collar is a real effective deterrent for the cutworms. And all you have to do is take a solo cup, a red solo cup, cut out the bottom, cut out on the side and wrap it around your plant and bury it in the ground about 1 inch. And that can protect your plant from cutworms, depending on how large your garden is.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point because they're going to cut it up above the ground a little bit. So, yeah.
All right, well, we are officially out of time. Thank you so much, Claire and Shane, for stepping up today and filling in when we were having technical issues. Thank you to everyone who attended today. We really appreciate you being here and rolling with us as we figure this out. So we will be back again tomorrow with our cover crop presentation and get all of that stuff in. Again, you'll get that email later today with the new link. We hope you all enjoyed the session today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for being here.